Well, thank you, Tammy, and thank you all for being here at the end of the semester. I know it's super busy for everyone, and I just really appreciate the opportunity to come up to Logan and visit with everyone. It's been outstanding to talk about things that I'm interested in and hear different perspectives, which I've had the benefit of all morning. So I have spent a little bit of time wandering around the planet, working in a number of really interesting places, but I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm just going to talk about, for the most part, Utah and what I've had some experiences here working in, mostly in high elevation locations, which is what you can see in the distance of this picture. That's the south rim of the Aquarius Plateau down in central Utah. That's the one of the highest elevation plateaus in all of North America. So even though the desert is what we're known for, at least in the southern part of the state, I'm going to be focused in mostly on the forest up in the top. So I do have a background in geography. All my degrees are in that. I've postdoced in a few locations where I've been in geography departments, but I've also worked in forestry departments and geology. So I'm a bit of a generalist, and I try to draw on all of those disciplines as we go through the talk. You'll hopefully see some pieces of that. My history sort of creeps out into this. I'm also a recovering musician, so you might get a little bit of that flair in there too. So what I'm trying to do here is at least take you through what is paleoecology first, and give you some ideas about that and what most people that go by that title do. And I'll start, hopefully, worked a minute ago, with just super general, super broad, where, when I say Earth's history, what are we talking about? I mean, the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. If we're thinking about, the distant geologic past, there's a whole lot of time that we could be talking about. But most paleoecologists like me, we're way up there at the top talking about either the Pleistocene or the Holocene. Since Utah, especially the high elevations, were glaciated pretty heavily during the last ice age, during the Pleistocene, most of the records that I'll talk about today are from the last 10,000 years or so of vegetation change, because they were covered in ice up until that point. So the Earth's history, of course, is very long, very storied, but it's the most recent part that I'm going to be talking about. And so I threw this in here because when I talk about history, I like to sort of wax philosophic, and people tend to think of this phrase, and this comes up a lot when I tell people that I work in paleoecology and I'm interested in environmental history is, well, certainly, we want to study that and understand it because what's happened in the past, it's going to happen again in the future. And I always think that people are referring to, like, don't invade Russia in the winter, right? And that's poor Napoleon losing out at Waterloo, and of course, the Nazis getting defeated, trying to invade during the wintertime, and nobody seemed to learn that lesson. But that really doesn't work, right, in an era of climate change where we're pumping out tremendous quantities of greenhouse gas. And I came across this rather recently, this synthesis of different CO2 records going back from the Antarctic ice cores all the way up to Charles David Keeling's measurements and beyond into the future. And we're sort of in this era now where, expecting the past to repeat itself is improbable, if not completely unlikely. And you can, just as in case you haven't seen something like this before, these stages in the CO2 levels, of course, correspond with relatively warm interglacials where they peak, and then the cold glacial periods over the Pleistocene, and then into the Holocene as we move forward in time. So there may not be a perfect analog, even though we spend a lot of time, or I spend a lot of time thinking about how to address the future. And when we think about the future, and if we talk to people about climate change and environmental change writ large, we tend to focus on the problems, right, which are deforestation, the way that we utilize and produce energy, and then, of course, the way that we produce food also contributes to all of these different controls and how we approach that non-analog scenario moving forward. And I realize this is from one of the older IPCC reports, but I like the way that it sort of clearly lays out, these scenarios where if we tweak the dials here, maybe we have a different or more desirable outcome. That said, most people don't want to talk about changing these things. And as individuals focused on climate change and trying to encourage humanity to engage in a little bit more intelligent behavior, we tend to focus on extremes because that gets people's attention. Droughts, forest fire encroaching on on houses, floods. This was from near Lyons, Colorado a few years ago, and of course, bark beetle outbreaks, which are near and dear to my heart, which I'll talk about some tomorrow. These are the things that get people's attention. So as scientists, we tend to push these out to the forefront. So for better or worse, that's what I'll be talking about mostly today, are extremes. And today I want to talk about, did that work? No? Okay, no problem. I want to talk about fire because it's in the news. We're seeing fire season extend both earlier and later in the year, and that has a synergistic effect, a positive feedback to an already warming climate system. So I want to talk about the past as it works towards the future. So to tweak that maxim or that idiom about the past repeating itself, I think this quote from Mark Twain kind of suits my purpose is a little bit better, that history doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. It's not going to happen the same way that it did in the past because we're so far down this other road. However, there are similarities that we can draw on. That's why it's important to look at the past. And so I drew out just a couple of key examples with fire. The first two have led to significant policy changes. And of course, in any forestry department, we talk about these events. The Big Burn in 1910, it's been chronicled in a number of books and films. And this led to a significant change in our policy because of the numerous firefighter deaths, right? And then 1988, we had another moment where our national conscience was raised or elevated, not because of deaths in this case, but because of the visibility of Yellowstone National Park. This was all over the news. Connie Chung, Dan Rather, talking all about forest fire disturbances. We were sort of swept away from the Iran-Contra affair and the other things that were going on at that point to talk about forest fire, which is really remarkable that an ecological process made it to the national news. In the pre-internet days, that's really, really amazing. So that was our next sea change moment. And then arguably, if we have another one, maybe this was just last year with the Camp Fire, where not firefighter deaths, but civilian deaths have resulted from this devastating fire that not only was human caused, but also happened in November, which is not something that we don't associate November with fire season, right? At least in the West, most of the West. And so where are we now with that? I don't know. I think we're kind of hanging in the balance, waiting for someone to come along to help us think about this a little bit differently on a national scale, because I threw this picture in from this NASA capture from 2017, which shows very clearly that a similar signature to that 1910 burn. And the jet stream has picked up the smoke from the fires in Oregon and Northern California and dispersed them all the way over to the eastern United States. We're crossing scales that we have not thought about before. And, if I can joke, we can't rake our way out of this, right? I spent some time in Finland, so I appreciate their sense of humor. This is a very well-manicured, finished forest, but this is going to take a lot of effort and insight from some smart leadership to get us there. One thing I picked up in Europe that hasn't quite made its way to the States just yet is this idea here. So all joking aside about raking, the European forests are intensively managed, and they are seeking feedback from the people that use the forests using stated choice models. And what these are, if you look at the peaks in the distance, you can see that they're all simulations of the same landscape. And people will be approached in the parking area or near the bus stop or the train station by these landscapes. And they ask people, how often do you return here? What makes you come back to visit? Given amplifying disturbances, you can see insect outbreaks, you can see timber harvest, you can see fire scars there. Which one of these are acceptable to you? Would you still come back given this scenario? Okay, so for my purposes, and when I talk about disturbances from here forward and looking at these different records, I'm going back to the White and Pickett definition that there's a discrete event in time that disrupts ecosystem function or process. That's what I'm looking at. With modern ecology or neo-ecology, it's really easy to identify a discrete event in time, just like we saw at that NASA capture. With paleoecology, it's a little bit more detective work, but I'm still operating around that idea that disturbances are discrete. Kinder McLaughlin published this paper in 2014 that was a really nice summation of how disturbances are reconstructed using paleoenvironmental records. And you can see, just a very quick scan here, you can see what we're pretty good at. There's a lot of things that kind of slip through the cracks that we're not so good at yet, but you can see the methods that are used over here. And those of you that work with tree rings, you're probably intimately familiar with these. I'm going to talk a little bit about how lake sediments in particular are used to reconstruct the fire and insect outbreaks in general. We're not so good at wind and not so good at drought just yet. So the three that I'll talk about, well, I'm probably just going to talk about two today, and I'll save the biogeochemistry for tomorrow. I'm going to talk about vegetation history and fire history and how that's done. So for paleoecologists, the way that we do things, and we have our field season just like anyone else, and we go out, we find a lake, usually a closed basin, and we use some sort of a raft device, and we go out and we collect a sediment core, which is what I've attempted to draw here. And using a number of chemical applications and sieving procedures, we can pull out pollen. That's a pine pollen grain there, or a fragment of charcoal. These are 20 microns across, and then if we're interested in biogeochemistry, we'll pull out the stable isotopes. And when you count each one of these points here, and they're plotted, then you have some record of a given tree species, right? There's lodgepole pine, there's Engelmann spruce, subalpine fir, and then you have a fire history alongside that, and then maybe some sort of a biogeochemical record. That's the crux of what we do. And a lot of that time generating those data are spent in front of a microscope. And for me, going through grad school during beginning in about 2004, the iPod was an amazing revolution in lab work, I'll tell you what. But pollen is really fascinating to look at. These are all members of Asteraceae family, so these are various sunflowers and daisies and things like that. And you can see the diversity inherent within even just a family. But a limitation of pollen, so here's our former state tree here in Utah, the blue spruce, and you can see in this, I love this picture, that you can see the pollen being dispersed by the wind. So the most prolific pollinators, the ones that get picked up by the wind, those are the ones that end up in the lake with abundance, and great abundance. You can see the male cones, the female cones, right, and it has a very, very nice clean distribution. Up on the left, that's a spruce pollen grain, okay? That spruce pollen grain is essentially identical to white spruce, which, this is from Alaska, this is out on the Kenai Peninsula. You can see the pollen being picked up there, same exact process, same exact morphology. You can't tell them apart with the naked eye. There's some people that are pursuing facial recognition software types approach to pollen to differentiate at the species level, but we're not there yet. But even though they're discrete in their distribution, completely different species, you can't tell them apart with the current level of technology. So that's an important limitation to note. Most of these get to the genus level, most pollen types. So I have to throw in a couple of quick pitches. So this year, a few years ago, the special issue was just completed this year, was the centenary of the very first quantitative pollen diagram. I do not expect you all to be as excited about that as I am, but for our subfield, it was pretty cool. And that was this guy here, Leonard von Post, who is a Swede. And this is a reproduction of the 1916 pollen diagram that he created. And so I want to draw out, though, his motto that he wrote on the front page of all of his field books, which you can see here, which translates to think horizontally, act vertically. And that's really what the essence of paleoecology is. We're collecting these cores. You can see he's standing in front of an exposure there. And then from that single point in space, we're trying to extrapolate about the entire landscape. So one other quick point. So he was a Swede. He developed this technique with some of his colleagues, but the individual that brought it to the US was Estella Leopold. And this is her here. That's an awesome picture. And I just want to point out her publication record. 1956, PNAS, 26, she's still publishing 60 years later on pollen reconstruction. She was, you might recognize the surname. That's Aldo Leopold's daughter. And she brought palynology to the United States, and she's still publishing in Seattle, Washington. So the second bit is charcoal morphology. And this is how we go about reconstructing fire events. And this has turned into a very nuanced specialization. So 10 years ago, a piece of charcoal was a piece of charcoal. You counted those, and you threw it on a graph. Now this has evolved into a number of different decision trees where you can actually track not only the type of plant, whether it was herbaceous or woody, but you can actually determine which type of material was combusted, whether it was a leaf or a branch or something like that. And you can see this decision tree from Collins' paper in 2015. This also has an interesting history that links with Yellowstone. Charcoal as a proxy was in its nascent stages in the early 90s. But the person that led this charge was Kathy Whitlock at Montana State. And her work was based out of Yellowstone. And so these by today's standards, very rudimentary plots of just taking these single pieces of charcoal and throwing them up along depth to track the imprint of that 1988 Yellowstone fire. So not only was it a watershed moment for our country from a forest management perspective, but for my particular subfield, this was transformative. And so she's done a lot of work in this area and continues to. From a statistical standpoint, we've gotten past that, and that's been led by this guy on the right here. That's Phil Higuera. He's at the University of Montana. And he developed a statistical software package that you can take these charcoal data, and these are what I'm going to be showing you later. That's why I'm going into it. You can take a single data stream, and you can decompose it into a background charcoal. So that's all the charcoal that's washing in off of the landscape or being deposited regionally. And then you can decompose that into local and regional trends. Okay, and so using those, this software applies a locally weighted threshold that tells you when that individual charcoal count significantly exceeds the background. So that's the discrete event in time. That's what Phil's software does. This is called CharAnalysis. And this is essentially peak detection. Okay? The important thing about that, especially if you're trying to take paleo data to the management community, is you have to have peaks in order to calculate a fire return interval. You can't just throw charcoal trends up there and say it looks like the fire return interval was 300 years or 80 years or whatever it was. You have to have peaks. And so that's the last time I would argue that this charcoal analysis is really transformed into something new. Okay, so getting back to work here in Utah. There's Andrea right there. That's a much younger version of me on the right. We're down on the Markagunt Plateau collecting sediment cores. And as you can probably look in the background and see, the reason we were down there is because of there's about 90 to 95% mortality of Engelmann spruce, and we were trying to track spruce beetle disturbances on this particular landscape. So, and I put this in here just to sort of hammer home that vertical versus horizontal point. So the places that I've been working at in Utah over the years are these 6 lakes. So we have Blue Lake and Emerald Lake. Those are up here on the Wasatch Plateau. They're 2 basins quite close to each other. Down here on the Aquarius, which is where that opening photo was from, that's where you have Purple Lake and Banana Lake. And then down here is Morris Pond and Alpine Pond. Steve Munson gave it the name Morris Pond. I did not self-name it. Anyway, so those are the 6 ones that I'll talk about, at least in part, today. So in Utah, even as we're thinking, we're thinking about the horizontal process and the way that trees move around, we are in a vertically oriented state, especially if you're up in high elevations. And that's why I threw this picture in here. This is from the Cedar Mountain range. This is on top of Delano Peak. And from here you can see all the way down to Antimony and the sagebrush steppe, and then all the way up here into the alpine tundra that's just dominated by a few grasses and herbs and a couple of mountain goats hanging out up there. Not these 2 people. But they're around. And what I'm tend to focus on, though, is that spruce parkland in the Krumholtz area there with these other ones. Oh, and then the key point I want to point out here, too, is the differences in the seasonality of precipitation. So these are climagraphs. You get a lot more precipitation down in the low elevations in late summer, and then you get, of course, quite a bit more during the winter, which has a pretty strong control in the vegetation that we see there. So, okay. To the Wasatch Plateau, there's two lakes here. There's Blue Lake and Emerald Lake. And this is a modern pollen diagram. These things send people into fits appropriately. So the way that these are interpreted generally, and I'll show you an updated version of this a little bit later, is so age over here is on the y-axis. And the reason that most paleoecologists do this is because this is the way that the core came out of the lake, right? So in that sort of law of superposition sense, if you're in geology, that's exactly what this is showing you. Then along the bottom are relative proportion. So in this way, you count all the pollen up, you hit at least 300 grains, and then you average it, right? And so each thing separates out into a different percentage. So what I want to draw your attention to here in this pollen diagram is here on the left is Engelmann spruce. And so for the last, just over 10,000 years, basically since the Wasatch Plateau deglaciated, spruce has been parked up there the entire time. And then here, it's what we generally associate with a spruce fir forest. Fir, subalpine fir, didn't really move in any abundance up until about 7,000 years ago. And that's essentially established the modern forest community as we see it today. So it's been hanging around a long time. And it's experienced pretty reasonable shifts in temperature and precipitation and disturbance regimes, yet these cling on at the top of the Wasatch Plateau, and they have for a long time, up until you can see there's something going on as we get near the top of the record, up in the modern period. This is what's going on. If you look on the far right, that's a spruce beetle epidemic that hit Blue Lake on the bottom and Emerald Lake on the top. But leading up to that, there were some other key events. Most notably, the pioneers had moved into Utah, and along with them came sheep. This figure at the top is estimating the number of sheep that were on the Wasatch Plateau in the late 19th century was almost 1 million head of sheep. That's staggering. And then there was also quite a bit of timber harvesting going on, mostly to provide for mine props and building structures, right? I mean, people are settling down in the dry, arid foothills below that, so they go up high, bring timber down. So this is actually a photo from the Wasatch Plateau. You can see all the sheep there. Between the timber harvesting and the sheep, it really did a number on the plateau. In fact, it was so severe, the denudation of the landscape, that the towns of Ephraim and Manti were essentially washed out with seasonal flooding. Every time it rained up high, there was no vegetation left to capture the water, and it rushed downhill. There's a very readable an interesting account of that by Marcus Hall, if you're into reading about the Wasatch Plateau. And it talks about the establishment of the first forest restoration entity up in the Wasatch Plateau in 1905. And so these are some of the features that they installed, these terraces to check the runoff. So the Holocene record, it shows that spruce and fir have been camped out up there for a long time. If we switch timescales here, so now we're down to the last 200 years, and check out what's going on, right? You can see this is again Engelmann spruce. There's a big dip right here around 1850 when the pioneers show up. Presumably that was logging related. There's another dip here. There's a small endemic spruce beetle outbreak. And then as we move towards the 1990s, there was the landscape scale spruce beetle outbreak that occurred up there. So you can track that change all the way from the settlement era all the way to modern, just looking at the spruce profile. So this raises some interesting questions, right? Is there a link between the logging that occurred in the 1800s and the spruce beetle outbreak that occurred during the 1990s? Is there a way to answer that question? So during this time, after I'd gone and cored this, I went to Russia with Heikki. That's it, Heikki there on the left. And I learned about a technique that he was using that uses pollen records to estimate biomass, so tons of carbon per hectare. And this is his paper from 2009 where he sussed out this method. And so what he essentially does is uses a composite of stand inventories around a lake and then Landsat images that show the density of vegetation and uses a calibration function to reconstruct biomass from pollen. So along with Justin DeRose, we had the idea to use inventory data that predated the bark beetle outbreak to reconstruct biomass, landscape scale biomass around Emerald Lake and Blue Lake, which is what this is just a summation of the stand demographics around those two lakes. And using Heikki's method, what we came up with was moving away from percentages, right, of pollen, which aren't very useful or instructive for any type of landscape assessment, and we converted that to biomass, which is what you can see on the top. And so in these top panels, what you're looking at is the amount of biomass that was reduced through first the logging event and then second the spruce beetle infestation. And what's really fascinating about that is, at least at Emerald Lake, which is much more accessible and it's pretty flat in general, the logging event in the settlement era appears to have really impacted the spruce even more so than the spruce beetle outbreak that had more than 90% mortality of the mature spruce, which is pretty interesting to see. Down here, this is just the ratio of spruce to fir. So in those codominant conifer systems, when the spruce gets hit by a spruce beetle, the fir gets real happy because there's more sunlight and nutrients and water, and they release. So this exchange is what is being tracked along that bottom panel. You can see very clearly that reciprocal relationship is pretty well established through at least the bark beetle outbreak, and less so with the settlement outbreak or settlement logging in Emerald. Okay, so that sets up another scenario or situation or interpretation of landscape succession and disturbance interactions, right? So potentially, with the settlement era logging, perhaps that set the stage for the spruce beetle outbreak that we saw later, right? And that seems somewhat intuitive if you reset the ecological clock and everything grows back at the same age and same diameter. Then for the spruce beetle, that would be like a buffet instead of just like a little snack pack of stands around the landscape, right? So that's one way that you can reconstruct vegetation history with pollen. And so just to kind of summarize those points, it's been spruce and fir, essentially since deglaciation. Those two mortality events were really significant and conspicuous in the record. Human interaction may have had something to do with that spruce beetle outbreak, but it started because of a landslide. That's where the incipient spruce beetle outbreaks began. So it still took that trigger that doesn't have anything to do with what people were doing in that landscape. Okay, so a little bit about fire history. Go back to the Aquarius Plateau. There's two lakes there, but I'm just going to talk about Purple Lake. And as I've alluded to, I was attracted to a lot of these landscapes because they were hit with spruce beetle. This one in particular, this lake, Purple Lake, was hit during the 1930s and 40s. And since then, as of 2010, it's almost completely regenerated. You'd be hard-pressed to the casual observer to notice that there was a spruce beetle outbreak looking at that most recent photo. So this is the fire history reconstruction from Purple Lake. That's what I'm showing you here. Again, time is on the y-axis. And I've used fellow Higuera's CharAnalysis program here and decomposed the background charcoal, which is this gray line, to the local charcoal, which is this black spiky signal, right? And then each of these plus signs are peak events, okay? This record is really interesting because if you go back to 9,000 years ago, this is all spruce this whole time as well. You can see that there's big peaks, there's frequent peaks, it's burning a lot, and then as you move forward in time to about 3,000 years ago, fire switches off until essentially people get back into the system, or Europeans get back into the system. And if you look at the fire return interval, this is episodes per 1,000 years, so 200-year fire return interval at the beginning of the record, 3,000 years ago, and it reduces almost to zero. So thinking about climate, if you look at the climograph on the upper panel on the right, there's a bimodal precipitation peak, right? A lot of places in southern Utah have this. There's that late spring peak in snow, and then there's a late summer peak that's, some people call a monsoon, but it's really just convective thunderstorms. And if you look at the fire occurrences, so these were summed since 1960 up until 2010, most of the reported fires occur in the late season when you might be expecting the monsoon, but the bulk of the area burned occurs during midsummer. So those shoulder seasons and the amount of precipitation probably are influencing this pattern that we're seeing, okay? I was perfectly happy leaving that right there because for paleoecologists, we can kind of wave our arms a little bit about climate because we only know so much about climate, but then there were some other considerations that came up that made me wonder if something else was going on, and this is where my interest in aspen kind of came into this. So this is the pollen diagram. Again, we have Engelmann spruce here, subalpine fir, and then here's aspen. And over that same fire-free interval, the aspen pollen increases conspicuously over that time. If you walk around the landscape surrounding Purple Lake, there's aspen dotted all through the forest. So what's going on with that? The conventional wisdom is that aspen has some synergy with fire. Why would aspen be increasing while charcoal production is decreasing? So I kind of put that on the shelf until this paper came along that showed, I guess, what I would have expected if aspen pollen were increasing, right? So if you look down here at this so-called Populus zone is what Vachel calls it, right there you can see that the fire peaks using the same statistical method that I was referring to earlier. You can see that charcoal production increases while aspen increases, which is more of what we would expect. So why? Why is that the case? And so that led to a different, I thought I'd throw Justin in here. He's moonlighting as a paleoecologist there. We found this lake down in southern Utah that has both aspen that you can see in the distance, and then you can see the white fir here in the foreground. This is a nice little lake, Sugarloaf Pond. It's about 8 meters deep, so it's really quite deep, at least as far as Utah lakes go. And it's surrounded by aspen, which is really rare. We looked all over the southern part of the state to find a lake that that was deep enough, it was perennially wet, and it was surrounded by aspen. Even though I was interested in spruce beetle, it was really convenient to work at the high elevations because that's where the lakes are. There's just not a lot of permanent water bodies down at this elevation. So this was a really fortunate find. So this is a paper that we've been working on and throwing all of this information in together about the stable versus sterile aspen communities, right? And so I'll walk around these different figures or these different plots pretty quickly, but you can see there on the top, that's the fire reconstruction, okay? And you can see how it's really, really spiky. Time is down here on the x-axis. That's what all the ecologists prefer. So we've moved time from the y-axis down here. And what you can see is up there some peaky fire events, and then we get to this massive fire event at about 1700. That's the most significant one in the record. And then charcoal production declines pretty significantly until present, right? These two panels right here, the fir pollen percent and the aspen pollen percent, what they show is that in the early part of the record, it was fir dominated. And if you see those little blocks, those are actually fir needles that were entrained in the sediments. So that's pretty convincing that fir was right there on top of the lake at that time. Moving forward, you can see right at that fire event, fir kind of crashes out. The needles become less frequent, and then as we approach the recent period, fir spikes back up. So if you remember that photo, you can see the fir in the foreground. It was much more abundant prior to that fire event than it is today. The aspen pollen down here has this sort of steady incline. And so following that fire event at about 1800, you can see that the aspen really takes off there. And so getting back up to that top panel where fire is, it becomes generally less frequent. So maybe there were less severe fires during that time period. The other thing that I'll point out here is this GAM model. And what this is showing is significant trends in the ratio, which we've plotted over here, of aspen to fir. And so over this time period, you can see I've put in parentheses there where the trend is positive and then where it's negative. And you can see two significant zones there, zone 5 and zone 3, where this transition towards relatively less fir and more aspen occurred. And this one is the one between 4 and 3 is very much tied in with that significant fire event. So there is a synergy, at least from this record, with aspen and fire. But what it appears is that there was a really severe fire event that occurred, knocked fir out of the system, and then aspen was able to move in and take over, at least until the recent couple of centuries, when we're seeing a switch back, potentially, towards fir-dominated. And so one last bit with Cedar Mountain, and then I'm going to conclude with some information about the Markagunt Plateau. So this was a model that Tom Brussel and Simon Brewer at the U constructed using the pollen data. So the top two plots are evenness, so how evenly distributed are the pollen taxa on the landscape, versus richness, which is just how many are there. And what's really perplexing about this to me is that there's this decline over the last 1,000 years in evenness, and then this increase in richness over that same period. And then if you look down here at the alpha and beta diversity, that 1,700-year fire event is a pretty significant transition in this watershed. And this is using the pollen data to capture those trends. So after some conversations this morning, I wanted to make sure that I hit the Markagunt Plateau, since I know there's some people that are working down there. And so this was a lake that I found during my dissertation that's just off of Cedar Break, so just a little bit north of Cedar Breaks National Monument. You can see where it is by the star over there. It's a small crescent-shaped lake that's outside of an expansive wetland meadow. There's, of course, a large fire up at the Brinehead Fire, but this did not impact that area at all. So it pretty much looks like it does in that bottom photo there. And so this is the fire history reconstruction over here on the left of this pond. And so if you look towards the top, you can see that the fire was relatively frequent at about 8,000 years ago. It became increasingly infrequent during the Middle Holocene, which you can sort of intuitively see down here with those low charcoal counts. And then as we move back towards the present, it starts becoming relatively less frequent with this trough here. And then, of course, we had that nearby fire just a few years ago. This middle plot here, that's the magnetic susceptibility. And what that tracks is the magnetic, the ability of the sediments to take a magnetic charge. And we use that as a proxy for topsoil erosion. So even though there were a number of charcoal peaks here, those ones in about 7,000 years ago, they appear to be pretty singular in terms of the entire record. So it was probably, we haven't seen fires like that since. In terms of the vegetation, this is, so when I was doing my dissertation, I counted those first two lakes, and then I was like, I'm really going to put my nose to the grindstone on this last lake. And I counted, I think this is 115 samples, if I remember right. A pollen sample takes about 3 hours to count, and then there was like 3 hours of processing before that. I was like, I'm really going to show something interesting by having this high-resolution record. And it looks just like the other ones. It's been spruced the entire time. It's just such a hardy tree, and there's not a lot of competition of things moving in and out on these plateaus. Fir has been a relatively minor player, as have the other taxa. So, up on top of the Markagunt, this is pretty much a spruce story with a few interlopers scattered here and there. You can see on the fifth one there, there's Populus that has kind of come in and out of the picture. It's been a relatively constant presence, which is, in contrast to the Aquarius, where, relatively speaking, Populus has increased at a sort of a rapid rate. But this is the Markagunt vegetation story. So what's been going on with that in terms of climate, right? We see all these fire dynamics of where fire appears to be more severe, and then it kind of retreats a little bit, and then it moves back in. So it's a climate story, and unlike a lot of places in the West, the Southwest is particularly susceptible to the comings and goings of the ENSO cycle, right? And in general, the La Nina cycle tends to promote really intense burning in the southwestern U.S. And so if you look up on that top plot, that's where we're seeing more intense El Nino. So we're going from extreme winter wet to extreme winter dry. That tends to increase from about 2,000 years forward. But nevertheless, where those really intense fires were, that's when we see almost no variability in ENSO. Which means, so the normal state of ENSO is La Nina. So it was probably quite a bit drier during the early Holocene in the winters, much less snowpack than we would expect today. And so it was probably promoting those really severe burning events. But as we move forward in time, the summers are becoming increasingly wetter, which is probably due to that increase in snowpack sort of lingering on and recharging the water table throughout the year. So with that, just a few conclusions here for you. So I think, in terms of paleoecology across the board, I think we do a pretty good job of kind of prescribing the community assemblage up until a point. There are underrepresented taxa, things that are pollinated by insects or the aquatic pollinated taxa. We don't really do those too well. We just don't have a way to capture that using lake sediments. I told you about the work using Heike's method of reconstructing population using biomass transfer functions. I think that's really useful because it gets us beyond just talking about relative proportions on the landscape, but we're actually talking about a meaningful metric, tons of carbon per hectare. I think there might be ways to get towards basal area or some other metric for a population, but we're not quite there yet, but I think we're getting there. In terms of fire history data, I mean, over the last 20, 30 years, we've come a long way from just counting bits of charcoal and plotting them. Now we have reasonably good statistical methods to decompose these data into something that's not only meaningful to us, but that's transferable to other fields, especially thinking about fire return intervals. Even though I showed you that decision tree with different types of charcoal, whether it's woody or herbaceous, we don't have a way to incorporate that into the statistical models yet. So even our lab methods are even a little bit ahead of the statistical method, but I think we'll get there, but it hasn't happened yet. And then last, so I work with, in a research group where we talk a lot about linking, these sort of neo-ecological methods. We had to give the ecologists something to differentiate us from paleo people, right? We had to have a prefix on there. But I think there are some synergies there. There's ways we can get, from plot level information, from stand demographies, tree ring information. We can integrate those better than we're doing right now, and get more information out of our lake sediment records, and hopefully provide some complement to the so-called neo-ecological community. So that's what I have for you. If you have any questions for me, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you for being here. Really appreciate it. Yes, sir.
Your columns that you showed, you have it with time, and I'm just wondering whether there's a difference in depth. In other words, is there more soil erosion at a certain point? Because obviously you could have a large depth of sediment that would be a short time.
Yeah, so in the lake cores themselves. So yes, that does happen in some types of lakes. Generally speaking, those layers will be really conspicuous, either in the magnetic susceptibility profile, because if you have a deflation event where there's clay particles or something picked up, it tends to concentrate the minerals, and it also creates a boundary that's really easy to spot when you pull the cores out of the tube. And that's not necessarily a deal breaker in terms of whether the record is useful, but the radiocarbon dates that are used to constrain the chronology would need to be very well tied around that point to separate what's missing or define what's missing. But it does happen, especially out here, in the arid west and lower elevation lakes. But the records I showed today, fortunately, did not have any of those events captured in them. They've stayed wet. Even that Markagunt Lake record was only 1.5 meters of water, but it was spring fed, so it appears to have stayed hydrated throughout the last 8,600 years.
Just based on your experience, was there a time when there was a lot of erosion?
So, yes. So in any post-fire event, you tend to see a slug of erosion come in. And I didn't talk about it as much. I didn't talk about it at all today. But it's something I want to talk about tomorrow with the biogeochemical indices, that you can actually track that really well, especially when you see like pulses of organic material coming in, that are just washing in off of the landscape. You can absolutely see that. And that can present all sorts of issues too, in terms of producing a credible chronology as far as age-depth relationship goes. Yeah, Paul.
If you back up to that color graphic where you had diversity and evenness, I wasn't clear on that. We got going pretty quick through that.
Yeah, I
was that species by pollen? What exact? Can you explain that a little bit more thoroughly?
So with the evenness and diversity?
What does evenness and richness mean?
So going back to where I showed you at the beginning, how that pollen, generally speaking, gets only down to the generic level, right? So that's what's loaded into here. So, and there are underrepresented taxa, but everything that's in the record is loaded into the evenness and richness calculations.
It's species, or I'm sorry, general.
Yeah, for the most part. There's a few exceptions. There's other places where we can only get to family. Yeah.
Wasn't sure what even was the category there.
Right, so the pollen data were loaded in, and so what evenness is telling you is that the relative, how evenly distributed are those types around the landscape at that point in time. So over the last 1,000 years, it's becoming relatively fewer types, more evenly distributed. And then with the diversity, that's just counting types. Yeah.
It's kind of curious. It looked like the amount of fires has been going down. It looks like it started like 2,500 to 2,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Is that due to humans, or what is that?
So let me, so something like this, for example, or something like that for certain. So I think what I showed with the INSO trajectory over that time period is really what's responsible, which is right here. So that Moy et al. Record, that's from Laguna Palacocha in Ecuador, and that's tracking, it's basically tracking the frequency and intensity of INSO, right, of El Nino, Southern Oscillation. And for the Southwest in particular, which most of Utah, not all, but most of Utah fits into that bin, especially the sites that I've talked about today, that there's an increase in El Nino events or disruptions, and that tends to deliver more snow, winter precip to the Southwest. So as snow tends to cling onto the landscape a little bit longer, it becomes a little more abundant, the water table becomes more saturated. I would argue that fire season is probably a little bit shorter over the last 3,000 years than it was before due to snowpack. And then the other dimension to that is that there's quite a bit of work that shows that there's an inverse relationship between the intensity of the North American monsoon and the amount of snowpack over the Colorado Plateau, which is where most of these sites are centered. So as we're basically, it's just staying really wet and cool, and we're getting probably less ignition with a reduced monsoon coming into the region. At the higher elevations, I think that's probably the case. I'm not quite as sure about lower elevations that are less snow dependent, which that's where I was with those two colleagues of mine standing on top of the peak in the Tushers. That's what I was trying to get at, is you can say one thing about the high elevations in Utah, but something very different might be taking place down at the low elevations because of that difference in seasonality. Precipitation seasonality, sorry.
Another question. Way at the beginning, you were on the Wasatch Plateau, and you're talking about those flood events, and I might not have this all right, so correct me, but you attributed a lot of the loss in spruce to logging in the 19th century, as I recall, but there was some tip-off by those landslide events. What I'm curious about is how did you distinguish the logging loss in spruce from the loss in mid and high elevation trees from human-caused fires, particularly settlers and particularly sheep herders, causing enormous amounts of fires on purpose? So did I miss something? Was there a mechanism where you distinguished those?
No, there was not. And with the case of those type of fires, unless they moved into the high elevations, they wouldn't be captured in these lakes. It would just be part of the background. So the way that the charcoal decomposition methods work is that it smooths out, especially it's basically the background, the stuff that's coming in off the landscape and through aerial transport. When you have a fire within a watershed, all of that material moving into the lake, there's a conspicuous, there's a massive spike compared to what just comes in at distance. So I think smaller fires like that would be set by sheep herders or even people going out into the forest to harvest timber or whatever they're doing. I don't think those would really be captured unless they went into one of these watersheds and brought 20 people with torches and really tried to burn the thing. And I'm being a little silly, but it'd be very difficult for that to register in the statistical decomposition techniques, like something that small. Does that answer your question?
I'm not sure, but you were saying there you definitely found a causal factor in logging.
So the logging it showed up. In the pollen profile, it registers clearly. Like you see the spruce go away. And at least with the environmental history that Marcus Hall put together, I mean, that jives very much with the historical documents that he consulted of what people were doing around the foothills of the Wasatch Plateau. And then that's corroborated by the floods that came down. And you could see in some of those pictures where they were cutting the terraces and the landscape had been completely denuded of vegetation. So I didn't go into that thinking it was a logging event. I went into that thinking it was a spruce beetle outbreak. And I was like, hooray, I've done it. I've reconstructed a spruce beetle outbreak. And then I read the historical documents. I was like, oh, people went in and cut down the trees. I guess that's cool, but it's not what I wanted to happen. Because beetles are just, infinitely more interesting, at least to me.
When you're talking about the beetles, and maybe it was the Wasatch, you mentioned a landslide.
Yes.
But I didn't catch the connection. You said, oh, but it was the landslide that actually caused it.
Yeah.
I didn't make that connection. Could you clarify?
Sure. So spruce beetles, when they build, incipient populations build, they generally capitalize first before temperature takes hold and kicks it over into a different reproductive cycle. They tend to thrive in downed or stressed spruce. The Wasatch Plateau is capped in limestone. That's chemically. It's chemically weathered very easily, so landslides are very common. And when they happen at the upper elevations where the spruce are, it's like whole part and parcel of the spruce forest slides downhill, tips over, the trees die relatively slowly, and spruce beetles just get in there and they can really get going when those landslides happen. So in the case of that 1980s outbreak, it was actually a landslide, and I think it was 12 Mile Canyon that tumbled down the slope. The spruces were tipped over, and that's where the outbreak actually got going, was in that downed spruce. So that, any given day you drive in the Wasatch Plateau and you can see slide features all down the canyons. And that one just happened to occur at the right time, I guess, for the spruce beetle.
Okay, there's no other questions. Let's make Jeff leave.
Thanks.